What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. Been quite some time since I last did a video. That's because I'm working on a very large project that I can honestly say I'm proud of. It means a lot to me because my dad and I, before he passed away, had plans on working on a book. And what I did was I took conversation of my dad and I, over 49 years of conversation, and I'm now documenting it. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the black fighters, the accomplishments, the wrongdoings, things that took place during the course of time. In this video, I'll go through bits and pieces of what I picked up during the course of conversation with my dad and research over the years. But I'll also end with the complete round robin of the Black Murderers Row, third wave. Now, the first fighter to regain a title after losing it would be the same fighter who was the first black world bantamweight, first black world featherweight champion, and his name was George Dixon. The thing about George Dixon, had over 1,000 fights, many are not documented. But George Dixon would also take part 2 fights of the death matches, which means one fighter was guaranteed to die. He also participated in battle royales. George Dixon would invent shadowboxing. June 27, 1890, in his 22nd professional bout, he would take on Nuke Wallace, and that would make George Dixon the first athlete to win a title overseas. He would become the first black bantamweight champion that evening. That was his 22nd professional bout. On his 29th professional bout, March 31st, 1891, he would take on Carl McCarthy, making him the first black featherweight champion and the first 2-weight division title holder. Boxing history. He was the first black world featherweight champion who would invent shadowboxing, the first black Canadian world champion. One last note on George Dixon. 1892, New Orleans. George Dixon would fight a fighter by the name of Jack Skelly, who was an amateur star. He would participate in what would be considered the Carnival of Champions, September 6, 1892. And he would beat up the American amateur champion, Jack Skelly, so badly that they would outlaw mixed race fights for 60 years. The next time you would have a black fighter fight a white fighter would be in 1952, and that was Kid Gavilan and Bobby Dykes of Texas. So George Dixon was a milestone. The first black world lightweight champion would also be the first black American champion. Also the first American champion to win a title. And his name was Joe Gans, the Old Master. May 12th, 1902 to July 4th, 1908. He would hold that title, taking it from Frank Ern and losing it to Battling Nelson. When he fought Nelson and Goldfield, 42 rounds, Nelson would foul Joe Gans so many times. You see, Joe Gans had to throw a lot of fights. I have him rated as the greatest lightweight in boxing history. I happen to have Benny Leonard number 2. Because of the circumstances that Joe Gans was under, he had to throw a lot of fights. He was so much better than the other fighters were that he had to handicap himself. And it's just unfortunate. Study Joe Gans, what a hell of a fighter he was. He was known as the Old Master, stood 5'6.5" inches, had a 66-inch reach. He invented the jab and a 1-2 combination punch. He was the first Black American world champion. Andy Bowen, who fought the longest glove match in boxing history, 110 rounds. And the thing about it, Andy Bowen was not supposed to be fighting that evening. He was the trainer. Fighter decided to pull out of the bout, and Joe Gans, who ironically was a little kid, wrote in a memoir, he remembers that fight. Andy Bowen and Jack Burkey would fight in a historic match. 110 rounds. And the reason why that bout that lasted 7 hours and a half to complete was because both men broke their hands. And the sad tragedy of Andy Bowen, who happens to be a black fighter, was hit in the side of the head in a bout with George Kid Lavin, who was a lightweight champion. He would hit his head on the concrete, develop a blood clot, and die. Andy Bowen was something else. Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, the first black world welterweight champion, the first black British-born world champion. He stood 5 foot and weighed 140 to 142 pounds. He was an orthodox boxer who had a 65-inch reach after becoming the first black fighter to ever challenge for a shot at the World Lightweight Championship title. October 29, 1897, with George Kid Lavin, the man that I just talked about, at the Leonard Athletic Club. And that's where Sam Langford would get his first start in Boston, the Leonard Athletic Club. Now, the welterweight champion was Mysterious Billy Smith. Joe Walcott would fight him December 6, 1898. He would lose that match. But on December 18, 1901, he would defeat Luke Ferns, stopping him in 5 rounds. Buffalo, New York, to become the first black welterweight champion in boxing history. Now, Walcott would be knocked out by young Peter Jackson, June 10, 1904, in 4 rounds. Young Peter Jackson would be stopped by Sam Langford for the colored middleweight championship belt. But Walcott would face Joe Gans and Sam Langford, Joe Chowinski, William Honey Medley, Larry Temple, Black Bell, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He would lose his title to Williams Honey Medley. What a fighter Joe Walcott was. Now, the first black world heavyweight champion would be Jack Johnson. December 26, 1908, he would knock out Tommy Burns, who was Noah Brousseau of Canada, 14 rounds in Sydney, Australia. And he would become the first black fighter to win a Texas State middleweight championship and then become the colored heavyweight champion in 1903. He would win the Black Heavyweight Championship title, May 6, 1899, Chicago, Illinois, by defeating Klondike Haynes in 3 rounds. That was his 3rd professional bout. He would win the World Colored Heavyweight Championship title. We would defeat Colorado's Denver Ed Martin, February 5th, 1903, at the Hazard Pavilion in Los Angeles, California. That would be his 22nd professional bout. He would take on fighters such as Sam Langford, 1906. And what was special about Sam Langford was that Sam Langford would become a 5-time colored heavyweight champion, 1-time colored middleweight champion, 1-time European middleweight champion. Sam Langford would win titles across the board. Dave Holly would introduce the orthodox Philly shoulder roll, better known as the loop-de-loop punch, where he would catch and shoot at the same time. He was a master at that. Larry Temple would introduce the original bolo punch. The longest world heavyweight champion, Joe Louis, who stood 6 foot 1.5 inches and had a 76-inch reach. June 22nd, 1937 to June 25th, 1948 would be the years of his world heavyweight championship reign. 1949, he would hang up the title for sure. And he would pass the baton to Jersey Joe Walcott and Cincinnati's finest, Azar Charles. September 27, 1950, he would take on Azar Charles, and he would officially be exempt as heavyweight champion. Now, he would fight James J. Braddock, Jersey Joe Walcott, Azar Charles. He had 25 World Heavyweight Championship title defenses, 10 World Champions, past or present, would be in his resume. He became the second black World Heavyweight Champion by an 8th-round knockout of James J. Braddock in Chicago's Comiskey Park. June 22nd, 1938. New York's Yankee Stadium. Louis knocks out Germany's Max Melley in 1 round. One of the greatest fighters of all times. Now, 1940 would produce 5 of the greatest world champs in boxing history. Ray Robinson, Azar Charles. I consider Bo Jack a 1940 fighter. Now, you would also have Ike Williams. They would be in good company with Willie Pep, Cleo Shane, and Jacob LaMotta. Now, Jacob LaMotta would turn professional in 1941, but he got his license in 1940. I consider him a 1940s fighter. Now, October 4th, 1940 would be a very special year. Ray Robinson would become the first black fighter who would become a world champion, who would pro debut at New York's Madison Square Garden under a main event, the World Welterweight Championship title match between Henry Armstrong and Fritzie Zivic. He would also become the 5th black World Welterweight Champion in 1946, December 20th to be exact. He would become the 3rd black middleweight champion in boxing history. Tiger Flowers, William Gorilla Jones, and Ray Robinson. Now, February 14th, 1951, Ray Robinson would become the 3rd black middleweight champion to hold the lineal undisputed world championship by stopping Jake LaMotta in 13 rounds. Ray Robinson would be the first fighter who would stop Jacob LaMotta. Jimmy Carter became the world lightweight champion, knocking out Ike Williams, May 25th, 1951. Till this day, he will be the first lightweight to regain his title twice. One to Patty DeMarco and once to Laura Solis. What a fighter Jimmy Carter was. Joe Brown, August 24th, 1956, became the old bones when he would defeat Wallace Bud Smith. Wallace Bud Smith would defeat Jimmy Carter in. Joe Brown would defeat Wallace Bud Smith. Let's clear that up. And he would have a reign of 12 title defenses before Roberto Duran would break the record. He would lose his title to Carlos Ortiz from the Bronx, New York. Great Puerto Rican fighter. Just passed away this year, 2022. Carlos Ortiz was a remarkable human being and a remarkable fighter. I watched him train fighters in Gleason's gym many years. He was a taxi cab driver in the Bronx, New York. R.I.P. to Carlos Ortiz. He would fight Joe Brown in Las Vegas, Nevada. And he would become the first Puerto Rican lightweight champion in boxing history. But he would defeat Joe Brown. Old Bones. I'll say one last thing about Ray Robinson. Ray Robinson would be the first to this day middleweight champion of any race to lose and regain that title in the same year, just a few months apart. But what was special about Ray Robinson, 1940, like I said, he turned professional with Ezra Charles and Willie Pep, Ike Williams. He was such a phenomenon that all those men that I mentioned lost their titles in 1950, 1951. But Ray Robinson would be the only fighter to regain his title of that bunch. He did it the same year. That was to the same fighter, Randy Turpin. He was a 5-time middleweight champion, defeating fighters such as Carl Bobo Olsen, Gene Fomer, Randy Turpin, Carmen Basilio. He would take the title from Jacob LaMotta. But he would become the 5th black welterweight champion when he would defeat Tommy Bell of Youngtown, Ohio. December 20th, 1946, New York's Madison Square Garden, where he would begin his professional career. What a phenomenal fighter Ray Robinson was. Archie Moore would become the 3rd black light heavyweight champion. The first fighter was Balansiki. The second fighter was the first black American light heavyweight champion. That was John Henry Lewis. Then you had Archie Moore. 1952, he would defeat Joey Maxim for that title. He made $800. Maxim made $100,000. Archie Moore had to sign with Jack Kearns, who was the former manager of Jack Dempsey and Mickey Walker, and the current, at that time, champion of Joey Maxim. And he had to guarantee Maxim rematches, which means that Kearns would be the manager of a champion one way or the other. Archie Moore was something else. He would hold that title for 10 years. He would be stripped of his title, 61 and 62. The NBA and the New York SAC would strip his titles from him. Bojack would fight more main event fights than anyone. 21, New York's Madison Square Garden. He'd be a 2-time lightweight champion, have his wars with Bob Montgomery and Ike Williams. He would defeat Ali Stoltz of New Jersey, and that would put him in line to face Tippy Larkin, the lightweight championship belt. The first black world middleweight champion, the Georgia Deacon, Theodore Tiger Flowers, who was a southpaw, February 26, 1926, in New York's Madison Square Garden. He would win a New York SAC in the NBA, the Ring Magazine belt, on the Pittsburgh Windmill, Harry Greb. The first black world light heavyweight champion was Balansiki, who was top champion at that time, George Compartier, in 6 rounds. George Compartier would fight in each weight division. What a remarkable fighter he was. He was known as the Orchid Man. And Balansiki was also the first African-born to become a world champion. John Henry Lewis would become the first black American light heavyweight champion. He would defeat Bob Molen October 31st, 1935 in 15 rounds. St. Louis, Missouri. He would have 5 title defenses between 1935 and 1938. And unfortunately for John Henry Lewis, he would begin to lose vision of one of his eyes. For that reason, he was stripped of one of his titles because he couldn't defend it against Tiger Jack Fox because he was not allowed to through the discretion of a physician. Because of that reason, he would be stripped of his title. He was a remarkable fighter. He would take on Al Gaynor in Connecticut. Then he would relinquish his title and face Joe Louis in his last bout, 1939 of January. And he would go on and own real estate in Harlem, New York. You could find John Henry Lewis, and Harry Wills, and Panama Joe Gans, Harry Smith, the Harlem Thunderbolt, George Godfrey, many of them. Grubb's Gymnasium on 116th Street in Harlem, New York. Floyd Patterson was a remarkable fighter. He would be the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history at the age of 21. And he would also become the first fighter in the heavyweight division to regain that title, to the man he lost it to, Ingemar Johansson. What was interesting about Floyd Patterson was that he won the title from Archie Moore. It was a vacant title that Rocky Marciano would relinquish in 1956. He would stop Archie Moore in 5 rounds, but he himself was knocked out in 5 rounds by Ingemar Johansson. Then he would knock out Ingemar Johansson in 5 rounds. Found out to be very interesting. Muhammad Ali, he would become a gold medal winner in 1960 in the Rome Games. What was interesting about him, he would defeat Sonny Liston in 1964, rematch him in 65. And he would be 22 years old when he won that title. But he would also be a part of something special. The first ever that 2 undisputed heavyweight champions would collide. March 8th, 1971, New York's Madison Square Garden, which was the mecca of boxing. That would be Muhammad Ali and Smoking Joe Frazier. It would be considered the fight of the century. Now, Amo Griffith was a phenomenal fighter. 6-time world champion. He was phenomenal. He was a junior middleweight champion, 3-time welterweight, 2-time middleweight champion. He would regain his welterweight championship belts from Benny Kid Perret, Luis Rodriguez. I had the pleasure of knowing Amo Griffith. He was a special humanitarian, I should say. I met Bo Jack and Ray Robinson and Henry Armstrong, Archie Moore, Charlie Burley, and many others. Walcott. But the man I'm going to talk about now, Charlie Burley, I have a special soft spot in my heart for because of what he has gone through. And not just him, many of them during that time. But in the case of Charlie Burley, and I told you I would talk about the Black Murderers Row. I'll do that in a separate video. But let me talk about Charlie Burley for one moment, because Charlie Burley, although a lot of people now with the internet are starting to research Charlie Burley, but he was never really appreciated for many years. And I learned about Charlie Burley when I was about 8 years old. Had the pleasure of meeting him, and he was inducted in the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1983. International Boxing Hall of Fame as well. And that's because of the internet age. People began to research and understand that era of boxing with the Black Murderers Row. But Charlie Dwayne Burley was born September 6, 1917 in Bismarck, Pennsylvania. He died October 16, 1992 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was 75 years of age at the time of his death. He stood 5'9.5", weighed 145 to 162 pounds, and had a record of 98 total bouts, 83 wins, 12 losses, 1 no contest, and 50 knockouts. Here's the thing with Charlie Burley. He used to spar with heavyweights and light heavyweights when he was a welterweight. He was fast with his hands and fast with his feet. And no one wanted to go near Charlie Burley because Charlie Burley was a very, very special fighter, unorthodox fighter. He doubled up on his punches and he hit very hard. He knocked out Harry Bobo in sparring, knocked out Jersey Joe Walcott in sparring. I can go on and on. Big Boy Brown. But what made Charlie Burley special to me was his ability to make adjustments during the course of a bout. He fought Fritzie Zivic 3 times. 1938, he didn't defeat him, although many felt that he did defeat him, but he didn't get the victory. And for that reason, he didn't face Henry Armstrong as Fritzie Zivic did. Henry Armstrong at that time was the welterweight champion of the world. He would defeat Barney Ross, who was a stablemate. Eddie Meade had both Barney Ross, Chalky Wright, and Henry Armstrong. And Charlie Burley, who, by the way, was the son of a coal miner. His mother was Irish. His father was black. And Burley was a troubled young man, and he would be directed into a gymnasium. And the family decided to move to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because they wanted to get him into a better environment. As a 12-year-old youngster, and Charlie Burley was signed up to join the K-Boys Club. Stay out of the streets. And it would be there where Burley would find his passion for the game of boxing. Howard Turner and Leonard Payne were the athletic coaches in that club. And they saw something special in Charlie Burley. Because Burley used to play baseball, as quiet as it's kept. He would pluck chicken feathers. But as a fighter, this man was remarkable. And he was asked to join the Olympic team. 1936, he refused because he didn't want to be a part of the racism that was going on during that time. Had he went, he would have been in the Berlin team, and he definitely would have won a gold medal. And what was interesting in 36, Joe Louis was knocked out by Max Schmeling. And when the Olympics went over to Germany, Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. No boxers won a medal. Burley would decide to turn professional September 29, 1936. Score a 4-round knockout over George Liggins. He would win Golden Gloves as an amateur. He would spar with Charlie Burley would spar with Edgar Charles and Cleo Shane. Many names that you may not be as familiar with. But Charles would stand out the most. Between 1936 and 1937, Burley would have 13 bouts, 8 knockouts, 4 decision wins. 1 loss. 1938, he would become a very special fighter because he would win and lose to Fritzie Zivic. At that time, Fritzie Zivic in Pittsburgh was known as the guy who was going to carry the mantle, although he had over 65 losses at the end of his career. But there were 5 Zivic brothers. 2 of them would participate in the Olympic Games, and they would both bring home gold medals. And Fritzie Zivic was the youngest brother and the only fighter of that family to win a world championship belt. He eye gouged. He choked. He hit low elbows when the referee wasn't looking. He was a very dirty fighter, but at the same time, he knew the tricks of the trade. And Fritzie Zivic would use those tricks on Henry Armstrong in 1940. Now, Fritzie Zivic was born May 8th, 1913, in Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania. He died May 16th, 1984, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had the pleasure of meeting Fritzie Zivic. He stood 5 foot 10 inches, weighed 128 to 160 pounds, and he was managed by Luke Carley. And he was trained by Bobby Quinn. His family was the only family on that block that had a Doberman pension in the front yard. He used to be tied to a tree. But Fritzie Zivic was something else. It really was. He'd be in the ring with Tony Falco and Billy Conn and Reuben Shank and Milt Aaron. Lou Ambers, Fidel LaBarber. I mean, he fought, not Fidel LaBarber, excuse me. Maxie Berger and Kid Astacker. Many of them. Freddie Ray Cochrane, Al Bunny Davis. So when he fought Ray Robinson in 41, Ray Robinson would tell you the man he learned the most from would be Fritzie Zivic. Zivic would eventually lose to Henry Armstrong in 1942 in San Francisco, California. 3 bouts. He would lose one of the 3. He would stop Henry Armstrong in 1941. And Armstrong would eventually get the victory in their last bout. Fritzie Zivic would eventually lose his title, his welterweight crown, to Freddie Ray Cochrane. I'm Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Look out for part 2 of this conversation of Black Murder's Row. I'm Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series, and we'll continue.